the air in the restaurant was heavy with the aroma of expensive wine and fine cuisine, a setting that screamed exclusivity and wealth. It was a world that Andrew could only observe from the outside. He had always felt like a shadow, wandering between the glittering lights and opulent surroundings, never truly part of the world he served. As a waiter, he had learned to smile through his pain, to hide the bitterness he felt whenever he saw the rich and famous, the ones who had everything he never could have. But tonight was different. Tonight, he stood in the midst of the crowd, carrying the weight of something much heavier than just the plates and glasses. The words that had been eating away at him for years were now threatening to break free. His frustration with life, with himself, was bubbling over, and it found its target in the most unlikely of places, Keanu Reeves. Keanu, a name known worldwide, was sitting at the table, effortlessly exuding the kind of calm elegance that only those who had tasted true success could. He was no stranger to the luxuries of life, but there was a subtle humility in him that Andrew couldn't stand. Keanu didn't carry the arrogance that the other celebrities often wore like a second skin. Instead, he had a kind, almost unassuming demeanor that made Andrew's blood boil. It was as if he knew he was above all of this, the fame, the money, the attention, and yet he didn't let it consume him. It was a constant reminder of everything Andrew lacked. The waiter approached with the menu, trying to hide the resentment that was beginning to take root. The last thing he wanted to do was serve someone who seemed to have it all, someone who had been handed a life of privilege, a life that Andrew could only dream of. But as he looked into Keanu's eyes, there was something else there, a quiet strength, a presence that disarmed him for a moment. It was almost as if Keanu could see through him, into the depths of his anger and frustration. Andrew's hand trembled as he set the menu down in front of Keanu. The words that had been building in him for so long finally spilled out. "You think you're better than everyone, don't you? With your perfect life, your fame, your wealth," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You walk around like you're some kind of saint, but you're just like the rest of them, just another rich man who's forgotten where he came from." Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't react with the shock or indignation that Andrew had expected. Instead, he simply looked at him with a quiet intensity, as though he could see right through the anger. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Keanu said softly, his voice calm. "But I can see that you're struggling with something. What happened to you?" The question hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. How could Keanu possibly understand? How could someone who had it all, who never had to fight for anything, even begin to comprehend the weight of Andrew's life? He had never been good enough for anyone, not his parents, not his lovers, not even the world around him. He had spent his entire life feeling like a failure, an afterthought. And now, here was this man, with everything he could ever want, asking about his pain, as though it meant anything to him. Andrew's eyes burned with frustration. "What do you care?" he snapped, taking a step back. "You have no idea what it's like to be me. To watch everyone around you live their perfect lives while you're stuck here, invisible." Keanu's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, Andrew saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, a recognition of something shared. But it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Andrew standing there, feeling even more exposed than before. "I care," Keanu said simply. "Because I've been where you are, Andrew. I've felt what you're feeling right now." Andrew stared at him, disbelief washing over him. "You," he muttered. "You've been invisible? You've been rejected? You, who have everything? Who has never known true suffering?" Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been there, too. I've lost people I loved. I've been betrayed. I've faced the kind of pain that changes you, that makes you feel like you're not enough. But I'm here to tell you, Andrew, that you are enough. You don't have to carry this anger, this hurt, anymore." The words felt like a slap to Andrew's face. How could Keanu, with all his success, all his fame, understand the depth of what he had been through. How could someone who seemed to have everything offer him advice about pain? And yet, there was something in Keanu's voice, something in the way he spoke, that made Andrew pause. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was possible to believe in what Keanu was saying. Could he let go of the anger, the resentment? Could he truly forgive? But before Andrew could respond, Keanu stood up, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that felt almost too intimate, too real. "You don't have to do it now," Keanu said softly. "But remember, the pain you're holding onto doesn't have to define you. You can let it go. And when you're ready, I'll be here." The words hung in the air as Keanu turned and walked away, leaving Andrew standing there, stunned and unsure of what had just happened. He had never been spoken to like that before, not by anyone. It was as if Keanu had seen something in him that no one else ever had, something that Andrew didn't even know existed within himself. As the night wore on, Andrew found himself lost in thought. The anger that had been driving him for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by something unfamiliar, hope. Could it be possible? Could he truly rise above all the pain he had carried for years? Could he, too, find peace? The question lingered in his mind long after the restaurant had emptied, and the lights had dimmed. And for the first time in his life, Andrew felt like he might be ready to find the answer. The night stretched on, but Andrew couldn't shake the strange sensation that had settled deep within him. He stood in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with the mechanical precision of someone who had been doing this for years, yet his mind was far from the soap and water in front of him. Keanu's words echoed in his head, relentless and intrusive. "You don't have to carry this anger." They replayed like a haunting melody, and the more he thought about it, the more the weight of his own resentment seemed to crumble. But the more it crumbled, the more exposed he felt. As if by holding onto that anger, at least he had something solid. The question began to gnaw at him: who was he without the rage? Without the bitterness that had fueled him for so long, what was left of him? A quiet sigh left his lips as he stacked the last of the plates in the drying rack, pushing the thoughts aside for the time being. But as he walked toward the break room, he spotted Keanu again, sitting by the window, his back turned, sipping a glass of wine. Something about the stillness of the moment called to him. The man who had insulted his very existence just a few minutes ago now appeared to be nothing more than another human being, someone who had been kind and honest in a world that could be anything but. "Keanu," Andrew called out before he could stop himself. Keanu didn't turn around, but his voice, low and calm, reached him instantly. "You're still here, Andrew. I didn't expect you to be, honestly. I know how people are. They say things in the heat of the moment, but they rarely go back on them." Andrew took a step closer. This time, there was no anger in him. Instead, there was confusion, a desire to understand why Keanu had even bothered. Why had he cared enough to speak those words to him, to make him question everything? "Why do you care?" Andrew finally asked, his voice shaky. "Why bother trying to reach someone like me? Someone who's done nothing but hate the world." Keanu's gaze finally lifted, meeting Andrew's eyes for the first time since their interaction earlier. His eyes, though weary, held a wisdom that seemed too heavy for someone of his age. "Because I see you, Andrew," he said simply. "I know what it's like to be so angry, so lost in that rage that it eats you from the inside out. I know what it's like to feel like you're invisible, like nothing you do will ever matter. But I also know this: you don't have to stay there." Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. The vulnerability in Keanu's words caught him off guard. It wasn't the pity that Andrew had expected, the condescending tone of someone who had it all. It was the raw honesty, the recognition of pain that mirrored his own. "And what if I can't let go?" Andrew asked, almost in a whisper. "What if I've been holding onto it for so long, it's all I have left?" Keanu's eyes softened, and he stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and measured. Then maybe you haven't reached the point where you're ready to let it go. But that doesn't mean you're stuck. No one is ever truly stuck. You just have to be willing to take the first step, even if it's the smallest one. The words hit Andrew like a jolt of electricity. He had never considered the possibility of moving forward. In his mind, he had always been trapped, stuck in a cycle of disappointment, self-loathing, and anger that he couldn't escape. Yet here was someone who was offering him a lifeline, a chance to escape the prison he had built for himself. "You've been through your own battles, haven't you?" Andrew asked, his voice cracking. "You've known pain, loss?" Keanu nodded, his face shadowed by a brief moment of something that Andrew couldn't quite read. "Yes. I've lost people I loved. I've been through betrayals. But those things don't define me. They are part of my story, but not the end of it." The silence between them grew thick as Andrew absorbed the weight of those words. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, the kind he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe it was time to let go, time to stop living for revenge, time to stop letting his anger control him. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "How do I start?" Andrew whispered, the question barely leaving his lips. Keanu stepped closer, his voice soft, almost a whisper itself. "Start with forgiveness, Andrew. Forgive yourself for everything you think you've done wrong. Forgive the people who've hurt you, even if they don't deserve it. And most importantly, forgive the world. Because, whether you want to admit it or not, it's not out to get you. Life is what you make of it. And it can be so much more than what you see right now." Andrew's heart raced, his chest tightening as if the weight of everything he had ever carried was lifting, only to reveal something more terrifying: vulnerability. Could he really do this? Could he forgive? As if sensing his internal struggle, Keanu placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder, a grounding presence. "It won't be easy. But the first step is realizing that you're worth more than your pain. And you don't have to keep holding on to it." For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt like he had a choice. He could keep hiding behind his anger, or he could try something different, something that terrified him but also filled him with a strange sense of hope. For the first time, he wasn't just a servant in someone else's life. He was someone who could choose a different path. Before Keanu could say anything else, Andrew looked up, his voice steady, for the first time in years. "Thank you. I think I'm ready." Keanu gave him a small smile, a nod of encouragement. "I believe you are." And with that, Andrew walked away from the kitchen that had held him captive for so long, stepping into the unknown with a heart full of hope and a mind finally free from the chains of his past. As Andrew walked out of the kitchen and into the main dining area, his mind was a whirlwind. Keanu's words kept replaying in his head, the weight of them slowly sinking in, a mixture of fear and exhilaration overwhelming him. He had spent so many years wrapped in a shroud of bitterness and anger, unable to see beyond his own hurt. Now, the idea of forgiveness, of letting go of the rage, seemed both impossible and oddly liberating. Could he really change? Could he really walk away from the toxic grip of resentment that had kept him alive for so long? But there was something about Keanu that stuck with him, something about the way Keanu had spoken, not with pity, but with a quiet strength, as if he knew the journey Andrew was about to undertake. It made Andrew feel like he wasn't alone in this, even though, for so many years, he had convinced himself that he had to handle everything on his own. His eyes scanned the room as he passed, noticing the guests enjoying their meals, some lost in their own conversations, others completely absorbed in the luxury of their surroundings. He couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. These people seemed to have it all: the perfect lives, the perfect families, the perfect futures. He had once dreamed of a life like that, one where he could enjoy such moments, free of worry, free of pain. But somehow, those dreams had been crushed, slowly, piece by piece, until they were nothing more than distant echoes of a life he would never have. But as his gaze landed on a familiar face at the bar, a sudden sense of dread washed over him. It was Clara, the woman who had been a constant presence in his life for years, the woman who had always been there when he needed her. She had never asked for anything in return, only to be loved, to be cherished. Yet, Andrew had taken her for granted, treated her with the same indifference that had consumed him for so long. He couldn't even remember the last time he had truly looked at her, truly seen her for who she was. She looked at him now, her eyes locking onto his, a question hanging in the air between them. He had ignored her for months, pushing her away as he spiraled further into his own self-pity. She had always been there for him, supporting him through his darkest days, but Andrew had never been able to reciprocate that love. He had never been able to love anyone, not even himself. As he approached her, the guilt hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew he had failed her, just as he had failed everyone else in his life. He had been too wrapped up in his own pain, too focused on his own anger, to notice the hurt he was causing those around him. But now, standing in front of her, he felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in years. "Clara," he whispered, his voice shaky. I've been so lost. I don't know how to fix this. How to make things right between us." Clara's expression softened, but her eyes were still filled with doubt. "Andrew, I've been waiting for you to see what's been right in front of you this whole time. I've been patient. But I can't keep waiting forever. You have to want this, too." Andrew's heart clenched at her words. He wanted to believe that it was possible, that they could pick up the pieces and start again, but there was still so much fear inside him. The fear of being vulnerable, of being open to love, only to have it all come crashing down again. He had built walls around his heart so high, so impenetrable, that he wasn't sure he could ever let anyone in again. "I want to try, Clara. I really do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to be the person I've been. But I don't know if I'm enough, if I can be enough." Clara reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You are enough, Andrew. You always were." But before he could respond, the sudden ring of his phone cut through the tension. The caller ID read unknown, and for a moment, he hesitated. Who could it be at this hour? With a sigh, he answered, still keeping his gaze locked on Clara. "Hello?" Andrew's voice was cautious, wary. A familiar voice on the other end of the line made his blood run cold. It was Keanu. His calm, measured tone was laced with an urgency that Andrew couldn't quite place. "Andrew, you need to come to the back room. Now." Without waiting for a response, Keanu hung up. A chill ran down Andrew's spine. What could be so urgent? His heart began to race, panic creeping in as he looked at Clara, unsure of how to explain the sudden shift in his demeanor. "I have to go," he said, his words rushing out. I'll be right back." Clara nodded, though her concern was evident. She didn't ask any more questions, but Andrew could see the worry in her eyes. He turned and made his way toward the back of the restaurant, every step heavy with the unknown. What had Keanu meant? Why had he called him like this? As he entered the back room, his eyes immediately met Keanu's. The man was standing by the kitchen door, his face unusually pale, his jaw clenched. "Keanu? What's going on?" Andrew asked, his voice tight with unease. Keanu motioned for him to come closer, his voice low and urgent. "You need to see this." Andrew followed him into the room, where a small group of staff members had gathered, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The sight that greeted him made his stomach churn. There, on the floor, was a receipt. The number on the ticket, the signature at the bottom. Andrew's heart dropped as he realized it was his. And the amount? It was staggering, far beyond anything he could ever afford. It was an exorbitant tip, a sum of money that should have been impossible for anyone in his position to give. But the most shocking part was the name on the receipt. It wasn't his. It was Keanu's. Keanu. Andrew's voice faltered, his mind spinning. What is this? Why? Before he could finish his sentence, Keanu turned to face him, his eyes filled with a strange mix of resignation and determination. Because you deserve more, Andrew. You've been running from your own worth for so long. But now, it's time you see it. You have the power to change. But first, you need to believe it. In that moment, everything in Andrew's world shifted. The anger, the fear, the confusion, it all seemed to evaporate in the wake of Keanu's words. And for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a glimmer of hope. Andrew stood in stunned silence as the room seemed to close in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, racing in a way that felt foreign to him, almost alien. The weight of Keanu's words pressed down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him was beginning to crack open, like a dam slowly giving way to a flood. Keanu's eyes remained locked on his, unwavering, as if waiting for him to process everything that had just been revealed. Andrew could hardly comprehend what had just unfolded. The receipt. The tip. It didn't make sense. Why had Keanu given him that money? Why had he stepped in when Andrew least expected it? And why did it feel like something much deeper was happening here, something that went beyond money, beyond generosity? What is this, Keanu? Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible. Why would you do this? Keanu didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence commanding. The others in the room remained silent, watching the exchange with rapt attention. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. You've been trapped in a cycle, Andrew, Keanu said, his voice calm, but firm. A cycle of self-doubt, guilt, and anger. You've let it define you, let it shape the way you see yourself. But this, he gestured to the receipt on the ground, this is your chance. It's an opportunity for you to break free from the past and recognize your worth. You've been punishing yourself for far too long, and it's time to stop. Andrew could feel the walls inside him beginning to crumble. He wanted to argue, to reject the notion that he was anything other than the mess he had convinced himself he was. But there was something in Keanu's eyes, something that felt like a mirror, reflecting back the truth he had spent so many years avoiding. The truth he had buried deep within himself, afraid to confront. You've been running from who you are, Andrew, Keanu continued, his gaze unwavering. But you don't have to run anymore. You've already been given everything you need to rise above it. It's in you, waiting to be uncovered. A tear slipped down Andrew's cheek before he could stop it. It wasn't from sadness, it was something else. A release. A catharsis. All the pain, the anger, the years of suffering that had been consuming him, it was all starting to make sense. The betrayal, the abandonment, the humiliation, it had all been a reflection of his own refusal to face the truth about himself. Why me? Andrew finally managed to choke out, his voice raw. Why are you doing this for me? Keanu took a step back inside, a long, almost weary exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. Because I've been where you are. I've felt the weight of the world crushing me, the pain of betrayal and rejection, the hopelessness of thinking that I would never be enough. But then, I realized something. I realized that I was never broken. I just hadn't found the strength to put the pieces back together. Andrew's heart clenched in his chest as Keanu's words reverberated in his mind. He had always believed that the broken pieces of him would never fit back together, that he was forever tainted by the mistakes of his past. But now, standing here, face to face with someone who seemed to have cracked the code of his own pain, Andrew couldn't help but wonder, Could he really change? Could he rebuild himself, piece by piece? You've been so focused on the mistakes, Keanu continued, his voice softening. On what's gone wrong, what you've lost, that you've failed to see the strength it's taken to get this far. You're not a failure, Andrew. You're a survivor. Andrew closed his eyes, the weight of Keanu's words sinking deep into his soul. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he never had before. The years of bitterness, the anger, the cynicism, they had all been his armor, his shield against the world. But now, that armor felt heavier than ever, suffocating him, holding him back from embracing the truth. I don't know if I can forgive myself, Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. Keanu stepped forward again, placing a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Forgiveness takes time, Andrew. But you have to start somewhere. You've got to start by accepting who you are and giving yourself the grace to grow. The room was quiet, the air thick with emotion. It was as if time had slowed, each second stretching out like an eternity. Andrew's mind raced, torn between the life he had known, the life he had built on the foundation of self-loathing and pain, and the possibility of something else, something better. He didn't know how to let go of everything he had held onto for so long, how to begin to trust again, but Keanu's words were like a lifeline, pulling him out of the darkness. For the first time, Andrew looked at the people around him, not with judgment, but with something else. Something softer. He saw Clara, standing off to the side, her eyes filled with worry and hope. He saw the other staff members, watching with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. And he saw Keanu, a man who had come into his life at a moment of complete despair, offering him something that felt like salvation. The truth was undeniable now. It wasn't the money, the tip, or even the luxury of the restaurant that mattered. It was the connection. The realization that there was more to life than the endless pursuit of success and recognition. That love, real, unconditional love, was the thing that could heal him. And it was the love he had been denying himself for so long. But just as the weight of this new understanding began to settle in, the silence was broken. The front door swung open, and a sudden commotion erupted from the dining area. The buzz of voices and footsteps filled the room, followed by a series of shouts and gasps. Andrew turned, his heart pounding in his chest as the scene unfolded before him. Something had happened, a crisis, a disturbance, something he hadn't anticipated. The moment of realization, the moment of clarity, was suddenly shattered by chaos. And in the midst of it all, Andrew's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Would this new shift in his life hold? Would he finally have the strength to face his own fears and rebuild himself, or would the weight of his past pull him back down once again? The room fell into chaos, the once elegant and tranquil atmosphere shattered by a sudden eruption of noise and confusion. Andrew's heart raced as the commotion spread, voices rising, footsteps hurried and frantic, as if the world itself was falling apart around him. He felt a surge of panic, his mind spinning, trying to grasp what was happening. But then, through the chaos, one figure emerged from the crowd, the one person Andrew least expected to see. It was Clara. She was holding something in her hands, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. As she moved toward him, Andrew's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her expression, the trembling in her hands, it was as if the earth itself had shifted beneath them, and Clara was the bearer of some terrible truth. "Andrew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the panic in it was unmistakable. "There's something's happened." He moved toward her, instinctively reaching out to take her by the shoulders. "What's going on? What's happening?" Clara's eyes darted around the room, avoiding his gaze, as if struggling to find the right words. "It's Keanu," she whispered. "Something's happened to him. I think he's in trouble." Andrew felt a cold rush of dread sweep over him, as if the air had thickened with an impending storm. Keanu, the man who had stepped into his life with such profound and unexpected wisdom, the one who had shown him a new way of seeing the world, was now in danger? It didn't make sense. How could this be happening, right when Andrew had just begun to feel a flicker of hope? Without thinking, Andrew grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the door. Where is he? What happened? They rushed through the corridors of the restaurant, the sound of their hurried footsteps echoing in the marble halls. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, her breath quickening. I don't know exactly, but I heard shouting. Then people started running. I think someone's attacked him. Andrew's stomach churned. Keanu had done nothing but offer him a path forward, a way to rise above his pain and guilt, a way to heal. To think that someone would harm him now, after everything, felt like a cruel twist of fate. But he couldn't afford to waste time. They had to get to him. They had to find him before it was too late. They burst into the back area of the restaurant, the noise growing louder, more intense. The once pristine kitchen was now a scene of chaos. Cooks and waitstaff were gathered in a huddle, some of them shouting, others frozen in shock, their eyes wide in disbelief. And there, in the center of it all, lay Keanu. He was sprawled on the ground, blood staining the floor beneath him, his body unmoving. A few people were crouched around him, but none of them seemed to know what to do. Clara gasped and stumbled forward, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Andrew's heart stopped for a moment as he knelt beside Keanu, his breath caught in his throat. Keanu! Andrew shouted, shaking him gently. Keanu, wake up! What happened? Keanu's eyes fluttered open, a faint groan escaping his lips as he slowly came to. His face was pale, his body limp, but there was something else, something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. He knew exactly what had happened, and even in his weakened state, it felt as though he had already made peace with it. Keanu, please! Andrew's voice cracked, desperation leaking through. Who did this to you? Why? Keanu's lips parted, and he let out a strained breath. It was no accident, Andrew, he whispered, barely audible. They came for me, because of you. Andrew's chest tightened, as though a vice were closing in on him. What do you mean? He asked, his voice rising in confusion and pain. What does this have to do with me? Keanu's hand weakly reached out to grab his arm, his grip weak but purposeful. They knew you were vulnerable. They knew you were questioning everything, and they wanted to take it all away. Andrew's mind was a whirlwind of questions, but the weight of what Keanu was saying began to settle in. There was a truth buried in those words, a truth he had only begun to understand. His life, his pain, his transformation, it was all connected to something much bigger than himself. There were forces at work that he had yet to comprehend, forces that didn't want him to find peace, to find the strength Keanu had so graciously shown him. I didn't ask for any of this, Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't ask for this pain. I didn't ask to be broken. Keanu's fingers squeezed his arm just a little tighter, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. No one asks for it, Andrew. But sometimes, pain is the only way we learn who we really are. It's the only way we realize that we have the power to overcome it. As Andrew looked at Keanu, lying there, injured but still fighting, something inside him clicked. He understood now. Keanu's wisdom, his presence, wasn't about offering easy answers or taking away the pain. It was about showing Andrew that he was capable of standing in the face of his fears, his failures, and his brokenness, and still rising. And as the noise and confusion of the restaurant swirled around them, Andrew made a decision. He wasn't going to let this be the end. He wasn't going to let his past, or anyone else, take away the chance at redemption that had been placed before him. Keanu had given him the tools, the belief, the light to fight for himself, and now it was time for Andrew to do the one thing he had never been able to do before. He was going to forgive himself. He was going to rise. But as the events unfolded and the pieces began to fall into place, he couldn't help but wonder what else lay ahead. What would the future hold for him and Keanu? Would they truly find the peace they were both so desperately seeking, or would the forces that had tried to break them both down finally win? The truth was, Andrew didn't know. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to find out. As the world around Andrew began to settle, the deafening silence that followed felt like an explosion of noise in itself. The weight of what had happened, the attack, Keanu's words, the realization of the dangerous web they were tangled in, crashed down on him like an unstoppable tide. He had always lived his life in the shadows of regret, drowning in his own fears and self-doubt, but now, in this moment of chaos, something inside him stirred. It wasn't just the adrenaline or the shock, it was something deeper, something primal. He stood over Keanu, who lay still, barely conscious but alive, and Andrew's heart clenched with a new sense of purpose. He couldn't lose this man, not now, not after everything he had taught him. He wasn't going to let the darkness win. Not this time. Clara, trembling beside him, stared at Keanu with wide, panicked eyes. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his forehead. The blood on the floor, the dirt that marked his skin, all of it seemed to fade away as Clara whispered softly, "He's going to be okay, right? Tell me he's going to be okay." Andrew's breath hitched. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but deep down, he wasn't sure. Keanu's condition was far worse than it seemed at first glance. His chest rose and fell slowly, and though his eyes flickered open, he looked at them as if he had already left this world in some way. The fight in him seemed to be gone, but Andrew couldn't allow himself to accept that. Keanu was a fighter, and Andrew had learned from him. Now, it was his turn to be strong. "We need to get him out of here," Andrew said, his voice harsh with determination. "Now." Without another word, Andrew scooped Keanu up as best as he could, ignoring the pain that shot through his muscles. His whole body seemed to be screaming for rest, for reprieve, but the only thing that mattered was getting Keanu to safety. Clara followed them, her steps quick and frantic, her hands clutched together as though in prayer. They navigated through the restaurant, past the stunned onlookers who hadn't even moved, as if frozen in place by the sheer horror of what had happened. The air was thick with tension, with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. As they reached the back exit, Clara turned to Andrew, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Where are we going?" she asked, breathless. "What do we do now?" Andrew's mind raced. He couldn't keep running, not forever. He had to do something. "We're getting him out of here. We're going to find a doctor, somewhere safe," he said, but even as he spoke, he realized he was trying to convince himself more than Clara. He had no clear plan, no solid idea of what came next. All he knew was that he couldn't let this be the end. He wouldn't let it. They reached the car, and Clara opened the door quickly, as if she could outrun the fear that had taken hold of them all. Andrew placed Keanu in the back seat, his head resting on Clara's lap, and then slid into the driver's seat. The car roared to life as they sped away from the restaurant, the city lights flashing by in a blur. Andrew gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, "They came for me, because of you." Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed, was part of some larger, darker plot that had been set in motion long before he ever met Keanu. Someone was watching him. Someone wanted him to fail, to fall back into the pit of self-doubt and despair that had once consumed him. But it wasn't just about him anymore. Keanu was lying unconscious in the back seat, and Clara, who had been with him through so much, was clinging to hope as if it was the last thread connecting her to a world that had become unrecognizable. What had they gotten themselves into? How far did this go? Andrew knew the answers to some of those questions, but the others, those were the ones that terrified him. A few miles down the road, Andrew's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled over quickly, his heart racing as he reached for it, praying it wasn't another threat, another piece of the puzzle he didn't understand. The message on the screen made his blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, the message brief and chilling: "You don't know who you're dealing with. You've crossed a line. There's no turning back now." Andrew's hands shook as he stared at the message. Who was this person? What did they want? And how did they know so much about him? Clara leaned forward, her voice tense with fear. What is it? What does it say? Andrew swallowed hard, forcing the words out. It's a warning. Someone knows about us. About what we're doing. The silence in the car felt suffocating. Clara's eyes widened, and her breath caught. We're in deeper than we thought, aren't we? Andrew nodded, his mind spinning. This was bigger than they could have ever imagined. The shadows that had been lurking on the edges of their lives were closing in, and now they had no choice but to confront them head-on. But even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Andrew felt something stir inside. He had been broken, abandoned, and humiliated. His entire life had been a series of painful lessons in rejection. But Keanu had shown him the strength to rise above it all. He had learned that no matter how dark the path seemed, there was always a way forward. There was always a way to fight back. And now, with Clara beside him, with Keanu's fate hanging in the balance, Andrew knew that he was no longer the man he had once been. He had a purpose now. He had a reason to fight. And no matter how twisted and dangerous the world around them had become, he would not let fear take control. He wouldn't let it defeat him. Not again. The only question now was, how far would he go to protect the people he loved? As the car sped down the highway, Andrew knew that the battle ahead would test everything he had learned, everything he had fought for. But he was ready. And he wasn't alone. The tension inside the car was palpable, the air thick with a sense of urgency and unease. Andrew's mind raced, each passing second feeling like an eternity. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, and yet, there was a fire in him now, a burning determination that refused to be extinguished. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the lights growing dimmer in the rearview mirror, Andrew made a decision. He couldn't keep running. Not anymore. He had to face whatever was coming head-on, for his own sake and for Clara's. But above all, he had to make sure Keanu didn't slip away. He owed him that much. He slammed the brakes, pulling the car off the road and onto a secluded dirt path. The engine sputtered to a stop, the sound of its silence feeling like a prelude to something inevitable. The moment they had been running from was finally here. Clara turned to Andrew, her eyes wild with fear, but also something else, something stronger. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. "We can't stop now. They'll find us." Andrew didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The weight of everything pressing down on him was almost too much to bear, but he forced himself to speak. "We end it tonight," he said, his voice firm. "This ends tonight. I'm not running anymore." Clara's face softened as she saw the fire in his eyes. She didn't question him. She knew that whatever they were about to face, it was something they had to face together. For Keanu. For themselves. They rushed to the back of the car, where Keanu remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Andrew scooped him up gently, his heart hammering in his chest as he realized just how much this man had come to mean to him. He was no longer just an ally. Keanu had become a symbol of everything Andrew had wanted to be. Brave. Resilient. Unbreakable. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees, their footsteps silent against the ground. As they reached the clearing, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps, as though he were the embodiment of everything Andrew had feared. "I knew you'd come," the man said, his voice low and cold. "But it's too late. There's no escaping what you've started." Andrew's heart clenched. He had known this moment was inevitable. This was it, the final confrontation. The person behind all of this. The one who had orchestrated everything. "What do you want from us?" Andrew demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You've already taken everything. What more do you want?" The man chuckled, his laugh echoing through the stillness of the night. "What do I want? I want what you took from me. You don't even know what you've stumbled into, do you?" Clara stepped forward, her eyes narrowed with defiance. "We know enough," she said, her voice steady. "And we're not afraid of you." For a moment, the man stood still, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Then, in a flash, he lunged toward them. But Andrew, fueled by everything he had learned, everything he had become, reacted instinctively. He grabbed a nearby branch, swinging it with all the strength he had. The man staggered back, surprised by the force of the attack. But he wasn't finished. He reached for a knife at his side, his eyes flashing with fury. Before he could strike, Keanu, who had been unconscious just moments before, stirred. With a sudden burst of energy, he pushed himself up, his eyes blazing with a fierceness that Andrew hadn't seen before. Without a word, Keanu charged at the man, knocking the knife from his hand and sending him crashing to the ground. The figure struggled, but Keanu held him down, his face inches from the man's. "You've already lost," Keanu hissed. "You thought you could break us? You were wrong." Andrew stood frozen for a moment, watching as Keanu took control, as if he had finally reclaimed the strength that had been taken from him. The power in that moment, seeing the man who had once been so vulnerable now fighting with every ounce of his being, was indescribable. The man gasped, a look of terror finally crossing his face. "You don't understand," he spat. "You're nothing. You'll never win." But Keanu's response was simple. "We already have." With one swift motion, Keanu subdued the man, ensuring that he wouldn't escape. Andrew and Clara moved to stand beside him, their breaths heavy but filled with a sense of victory. For the first time in a long while, Andrew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The darkness that had haunted him for so long, threatening to swallow him whole, had been banished. And standing there, in the quiet of the night, with Clara and Keanu at his side, Andrew realized something profound. He wasn't the man he once was. The fear, the self-doubt, the brokenness, it was all behind him now. He had fought for something worth fighting for. He had stood by those who mattered to him, and in doing so, he had become the man he had always wanted to be. In the end, it wasn't about the fight. It wasn't about the shadows that had followed them. It was about the light that had emerged from within them, the strength they had found in each other. And as the man who had orchestrated it all was taken away, Andrew's voice was steady. "This is where it ends. No more lies. No more fear." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with pride. Keanu, battered but unbroken, stood tall beside them. The battle was over. But the war, no, the journey, had only just begun. And for the first time in a long while, Andrew felt a sense of peace. He had found his strength. He had found his family. And no matter what the future held, he knew they would face it together. With nothing left to fear.